It was to be expected that organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union and eminent liberal journalists like John Gunther and Dorothy Thompson would be outraged by the Detroit riots and immediately make public their disgust. But so too were many conventional middle-class Americans who, even if they found Walter Winchell and his rhetoric repugnant and understood him to be asking for trouble, were also appalled by the eyewitness reports of how the rioting that had begun at Winchell's first stop in Hamtramck, the residential section inhabited chiefly by auto workers and their families, and said to contain the world's largest Polish population outside Warsaw, had suspiciously spread within minutes to 12th Street, to Linwood Avenue, and then to Dexter Boulevard. There, in the city's biggest Jewish neighborhood, shops were looted and windows broken. Jews trapped outdoors were set upon and beaten, and kerosene-soaked crosses were ignited on the lawns of the fancy houses along Chicago Boulevard and out front of the modest two-family dwellings of the house painters, plumbers, butchers, bakers, junk dealers, and grocers who lived on Webb and Tuxedo, and in the little dirt yards of the poorest Jews in Pingree and Euclid. In mid-afternoon, only moments before the school day ended, a firebomb was thrown into the front foyer of Winterhalter Elementary School, where half the students were Jewish, another into the foyer of Central High, whose student body was 95% Jewish, another through a window at the Sholem Aleichem Institute, a cultural organization Coughlin had ridiculously identified as communist, and a fourth, outside another of Coughlin's communist targets, the Jewish Workers' Alliance. Next came the attack on houses of worship. Not only were windows broken and walls defaced on some of the city's 30-odd Orthodox synagogues, but as evening services were scheduled to begin, an explosion went off on the steps of the prestigious Chicago Boulevard Temple, Shaarei Zedek. The explosion there caused extensive damage to the exotic centerpiece of architect Albert Kahn's Moorish design, the three massive arched doorways that conspicuously exhibited to a working-class populace a distinctively un-American style. Five passersby, none of whom happened to be Jewish, were injured by flying debris from the facade, but no casualties were otherwise reported. By nightfall, several hundred of the city's 30,000 Jews had fled and taken refuge across the Detroit River in Windsor, Ontario, and American history had recorded its first large-scale pogrom, one clearly modeled on the spontaneous demonstrations against Germany's Jews known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, whose atrocities had been planned and perpetuated by Nazis 4 years earlier, and which Father Coughlin in his weekly tabloid Social Justice had defended at the time as a reaction by the Germans against Jewish-inspired communism. Detroit's Kristallnacht was similarly justified in the editorial pages of the Detroit Times as the unfortunate but inevitable and altogether understandable backlash to activities of the troublemaking interloper, the paper identified as the Jewish demagogue whose aim from the outset had been to incite the rage of patriotic Americans with his treasonous rabble-rousing. The week after the September assault on Detroit's Jews, which was addressed with dispatch by neither Michigan's governor nor the city's mayor, new violence was directed at homes, shops, and synagogues in Jewish neighborhoods in Cleveland, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and St. Louis, violence that Winchell's enemies attributed to his deliberately challenging appearances in those cities after the cataclysm that he'd instigated in Detroit, and that Winchell himself, who in Indianapolis barely escaped being crushed by a paving stone hurled from a rooftop that had broken the neck of the bodyguard positioned beside him, explained by the climate of hate emanating from the White House. Our own street in Newark was many hundreds of miles from Dexter Boulevard in Detroit. Nobody around had ever been to Detroit. And before September 1942, all the boys on the block knew about Detroit was that organized baseball's only Jewish player was the Tigers' star first baseman, Hank Greenberg. But then came the Winchell Riots, and suddenly even children could recite the names of the Detroit neighborhoods that had been shaken by violence. Parroting what they heard from their parents, they would argue back and forth as to whether Walter Winchell was courageous or foolish, self-sacrificing or self-serving, and whether or not he was playing right into Lindbergh's hands by allowing the Gentiles to tell themselves that the Jews had brought their misery on themselves. They argued over whether it would be better if, before Winchell set off a nationwide pogrom, he desisted and allowed normal relations to be restored between Jews and their fellow Americans, or whether, in the long run, it would be better for him to continue to raise the alarm among the country's more commonplacement Jews, and to arouse the conscience of Christians by exposing the menace of anti-Semitism from one end of America to the other. On the way to school, on the playground after school, between classes, in the school corridors, you would see the smartest kids standing toe-to-toe, kids Sandy's age, as well as a few no older than me, heatedly debating whether Walter Winchell's crisscrossing the country with his soapbox to flush into the open the German-American Bundists and the Coughlinites and the Ku Klux Klanners and the Silver Shirts and the America Firsters and the Black Legion and the American Nazi Party, whether these organized anti-Semites and their thousands of unseen sympathizers to reveal themselves for what they were and to reveal the president for what he was, a chief executive and commander-in-chief who hadn't yet bothered to acknowledge that anything like a state of emergency existed, let alone called for federal troops to prevent further rioting, was good for the Jews or bad for the Jews. After Detroit, the Jews of Newark, numbering some 50,000 in a city of well over 500,000, began to ready themselves for serious violence erupting on their own streets, either because of a Winchell visit to New Jersey when he swung back east, or because of the riots inevitably spilling over into cities where, as in Newark, there was a heavily Jewish neighborhood abutting large communities of working-class Irish, Italians, Germans, and Slavs that were already home to a goodly number of bigots. The assumption was that these people wouldn't require much encouragement to be molded into a mindless, destructive mob by the pro-Nazi conspiracy that had successfully plotted the riot in Detroit. Almost overnight, Rabbi Joachim Prinz, along with 5 other eminent Newark Jews, including Mayor Ellenstein, established the Newark Committee of Concerned Jewish Citizens. Quickly, the group became a model for similar ad hoc Jewish citizens groups in other big cities that were determined to ensure their community's safety by enlisting the authorities to draw up contingency plans to prepare for the worst possibility. The Newark Committee arranged first for a city hall meeting presided over by Mayor Murphy, whose election had ended Ellenstein's 8-year tenure with Newark's police chief, fire chief, and director of Department of Public Safety. The next day, the committee met at the state hospital, the next day, the committee met at the State House in Trenton with Democratic Governor Charles Edison, the superintendent of the New Jersey State Police, and the commanding officer of the New Jersey National Guard, Attorney General Willits. An acquaintance of all 6 committee members also attended, and in the bulletin the Newark Committee issued to the Jersey papers, he was reported as having assured Rabbi Prince that anyone attempting an assault on the Jews of Newark would be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. The committee next telegrammed Rabbi Bengelsdorf requesting a meeting with him in Washington, but was informed that theirs was a local and not a federal issue, and advised to address their concern, as they were doing, to state and city officials. Partisans of Rabbi Bengelsdorf lauded him for keeping himself aloof from the sordid Walter Winchell affair, while quietly, in private White House conversations with Mrs. Lindbergh, urging assistance to those innocent Jews throughout the country who were tragically paying for their iniquitous conduct of the renegade candidate, a provocateur cynically encouraging American citizens who needed in no way to feel besieged to cling to their oldest, most crippling anxieties. The Bengelsdorf supporters constituted an influential clique drawn from the highly assimilated upper echelon of German Jewish society. A good many of them had been born to wealth and were among the first Jewish generation to attend elite secondary schools and Ivy League colleges, where, because their numbers were minute, they had mingled with non-Jews who they subsequently associated with in communal, political, and business endeavors, and who sometimes appeared to accept them as equals. To these privileged Jews, there was nothing suspicious about the programs designed by Rabbi Bengelsdorf's agency to assist poorer, less cultivated Jews in learning to live in closer harmony with the nation's Christians. What was unfortunate, in their opinion, was that Jews, like us, continued to huddle together in cities like Newark out of a xenophobia fostered by historical pressures that no longer existed. The status conferred by economic and vocational advantage inclined them to believe that those who lacked their prestige were rebuffed by the larger society more because of insular clannishness than because of any pronounced taste of exclusiveness on the part of the Christian majority, and that neighborhoods like ours were less the result of discrimination than its breeding grounds. They recognized, of course, that there were pockets of backward people in America, among whom virulent anti-Semitism was still their strongest, most obsessive passion, but that seemingly only another reason for the dictator of the OAA to encourage Jews handicapped by the limitations of a segregated existence to at least permit their children to enter the American mainstream and show themselves there to be nothing like the caricature of the Jew disseminated by our enemies. Why these wealthy, urbane, self-assured Jews particularly abhorred the self-caricaturing Winchell was because he oh so deliberately reinforced the very hostility that they imagined themselves to have propitiated by their exemplary behavior toward their Christian colleagues and friends. Aside from Rabbi Prinz and ex-Mayor Ellenstein, the four remaining members of the Newark Committee were elderly civic leaders responsible for the success of the Americanization programs for immigrant children in the Newark school system, and the wife of Beth Israel Hospital's leading surgeon, Jenny Danzis, the department store executive and son of the founder S. Pot & Co., as well as 10-time president of the Broad Street Association, Moses Plott, the prominent city proprietor, owner, and past president of the Newark Conference of Jewish Charities, community leader Michael Stravitsky, and the chief of Beth Israel's medical staff, Dr. Eugene Parsonet. That Newark's leading mobster, Longies Willman, hadn't been enlisted to join a group of local Jews as distinguished as this was no surprise to anyone, even though Longy was a wealthy man of enormous influence and hardly less distressed than Rabbi Prinz by the menace posed by the anti-Semites who, under the pretext of being provoked by Walter Winchell, had ushered in what looked to many like stage one of the resolution of Henry Ford's Jewish question. Longy set out separately, apart from the many civil authorities who had promised Rabbi Prinz their fullest cooperation, to ensure that if and when Newark cops and New Jersey state troopers failed to respond any more vigorously than the police had to the disorder in Boston and Detroit, the city's Jews would not be left unprotected. Bullet Afflebaum, the close associate known throughout the city as Longy's chief enforcer, and the older brother of Niggy Afflebaum, was assigned by Longy to supplement the good work of the Newark Committee of Commercial Jewish Citizens by recruiting that scattering of incorrigible Jewish kids who had failed to graduate from high school and training them as cadre for a hastily assembled volunteer corps to be called the Provisional Jewish Police. These were local boys without any of the ideas that were embedded in the rest of us, who'd already begun to emanate an aura of lawlessness as far back as the 5th grade, inflating condoms in the school toilet and breaking into fistfights on the 14 bus and wrestling till they bled onto the concrete sidewalk outside the movies, the ones who, during their years in school, parents directed their children to have nothing to do with, and who were now in their 20s and occupied running numbers and shooting pool and washing dishes in kitchens of one another or the neighborhood's delicatessen restaurants. To most of us, they were known, if at all, by the hoodlum magic of their supercharged nicknames: Leo the Lion Nussbaum, Knuckles Kimmelman, Big Jerry Schwartz, Dummy Breitbart, Duke It Out Glick, and by their double IQ scores.